Good morning. It's 9:03 and it's time for worship. Our scripture lesson this morning is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. I'm going to read from verse 1 through verse 8. Hear the word of the Lord. You yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you, that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. May God bless this reading of his holy word. Paul says here, although we had already suffered at Philippi. Do you remember what happened at Philippi? I mean, in light of what happened, Paul here is the master of understatement. Yes, he had already suffered at Philippi. If you were to turn to Philippi and read that story, or rather to turn to Acts and read the story of what happened at Philippi, you discover that there was in Philippi a demon-possessed woman who was telling the future. And by doing that, making a lot of money for her owner. She was a slave woman. And so Paul, after allowing this woman to follow him around for a while, got tired of it and cast out the demon. And when that happened, of course, the owner lost the ability to make money because she lost her demonic talent. And for that, he was stripped and he was beaten and he was thrown in prison. And while he was in prison, there was an earthquake, and the earthquake burst open the bars of the prison. The jailer thought everybody would have escaped. So when he saw the doors open, he was about to kill himself, and Paul intervened, and the jailer was astonished to find all the prisoners still there. They had been listening to Paul as he was singing and preaching. And so the jailer took him home and cared for his wounds, and he and his whole family were baptized. This is the place where Paul met Lydia, and she and her husband founded that church. And after that adventure and that night and that opportunity to preach to the jailer's family, the authorities finally called him out of the prison and threw him out of town. So when he says, we've already been mistreated in Philippi, yeah, beaten, stripped, in prison, survived an earthquake, and thrown out of town, that qualifies. Now let me ask you, if I were to persuade you that you should go over here to the next town and preach the gospel, and you muster the courage to go, and in that town you are arrested and beaten and stripped and thrown into jail, and then there's an earthquake, and that's the incident that causes the doors to pop open so you can get out, and you do get to preach and bring at least one family to faith, but the next day you're thrown out of town. When you come back here and talk to me, are you still an evangelist? Or have you learned your lesson? Paul was slow to learn any lesson except that he was an evangelist. That's what happened in Philippi. It's repeated in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, there are riots, and the fellow who had been hosting him in his home was beaten, and he was threatened, and the church was threatened. And so in the middle of the night, they let Paul over the wall of the city in a basket and lowered him to the ground so that he could escape. If I persuaded you to go over there, and you were stripped and beaten and thrown in jail and managed to survive that, and I said, I think you're still called to be an evangelist. Go over here to this town next door and see how things go there, and there you inspire riots, and the person who hosts you is beaten, and they have to sneak you out of town in the dead of night. Are you still an evangelist? Or do you think you might have learned your lesson? Do you think you're going to look for your calling somewhere else? Thanks be to God, Paul was so certain of his calling that in the face of this kind of opposition, he was still an evangelist. He was still wondering how to reach the next town, how to share the gospel with the next family, how to find an opportunity to bring people to faith in spite of all that happened to him. Not everyone can do that. I've asked a couple of times, have you learned your lesson? Some of us have experiences in life where the plan that we had changes because we've learned our lesson. I had that experience in second grade. In second grade, my older brothers having played baseball for a while, I was happy that I was old enough to be in Little League. And I remember that season. What a wonderful season it was. I never once got a hit. I struck out every time I came to bat. My team quickly learned that that was the pattern. They would groan and mock me. You know, your own team is supposed to cheer for you. The opposing team is supposed to mock you. But no, my guys were on their side and mocking me before I even got up to the plate. I couldn't throw very well, so in the outfield, if I did manage to chase down a ball, I'd usually throw it to the nearest teammate, and they would throw it back to home plate for me. I still remember catching that one ground ball that should have been a moment of glory, except when I put my glove down, it ran up the glove into my chin, gave me a bloody nose. It didn't work out very well. I had learned my lesson. As if the lessons on the field weren't enough to teach me that I'm not a ball player. Apparently, I was such a great player that my coach forgot I was on the team, because on the occasions when we won, he would take us out to one of the local drive-ins and he'd buy a Coke for the whole team. And as I'm finishing my Coke, I look up to see that all the kids have gotten into the cars with the adults and they've all left, and they left me there. The other side of town, fortunately, I knew which way was home, and in my Little League uniform, I started walking home. I was about halfway home before my dad came and picked me up. Somehow he noticed when all the parents arrived that I wasn't with them. I'm glad that he was paying attention. So one year I learned, are you still a ball player? Nope, not my calling. I was crystal clear about that. I had to play one more year to make it clear to my dad, but it was clear to me right away. If you had Paul's experiences, would you still be an evangelist? Or let me just ask, since we're on the topic, knowing that Christians are called to share their faith, thinking of how you came to faith and your enthusiasm then, and how you're feeling today, were there plans you had then that you've modified in face of the experiences you had? Or is your calling so clear to you, and has God made it so compelling that you're hanging on to that no matter what? Some people are able to do that. Their calling is so clear that the circumstances do not change their purpose and their vision for the future. Kenny Rogers, since we're talking about baseball, did a great song about that. He talked about the little boy who went out to, play a little baseball with his bat and ball, that kind where you toss the ball up in the air and you swing and you hit it yourself. He's got a great song about the little boy who went out to do that, and the chorus is, the ball went up and the ball came down. He swung the bat all the way around. The world's as still as it can be, and the ball hits the ground. 3 times he does it. And the last time, of course, the chorus ends with, and that's strike 3. So you would think at that point in the song, this little boy is so disappointed that he can't hit the ball. He has struck himself out, that he would go home dejected. But the verse picks up with supper time and his mama calls, picks up his bat, picks up his ball. And he says to himself, I am the greatest, that is a fact. But even I didn't know I could pitch like that. Do you see the difference? You might say, man, I missed 3 times, I stink. But this kid said, I am the greatest. Even I didn't know I could pitch like that. If Paul had been in Little League, that's the song they would have written about him. He was just plain too stubborn to know when he's having a bad day. And no matter what happens, he was able to reinterpret that as if it was glorious. Sometimes people are clear in their calling. Other times people are trying out a new idea. If you're trying out a new idea, a terrible circumstance might make you think this is not for me. But if you're clear in your calling, all of the circumstances, good or bad, have to be interpreted in light of that calling, and your calling doesn't change. You just learn different lessons day by day. That's why Paul goes on here to say, I have worked harder. Actually, this is a portion we find him saying in 2 Corinthians, not in Thessalonians, but in 2 Corinthians, when he's reflecting on the call that he has, he describes it this way: I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rod. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. In Damascus, the governor had the city guarded in order to arrest me, but I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. So, some people, having experiences like that, would say, clearly, I should be doing something else. But Paul was clear in his purpose. God had appointed him an evangelist. No matter what the circumstances were, he was going to be faithful to preach. He might, along the way, learn the signs of a crowd that's about to riot and learn how to slip out a side way. He might, after a while, learn the signs of a political system that's starting to get upset and learn how to mollify them just a little bit. But for the most part, he's just crystal clear that he has to preach the gospel, and no matter what happens, he's going to do that. So when he writes here, we have already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, yeah, he certainly has. We had courage in God. We had courage, God, to declare the gospel of God in spite of great opposition, for our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery. Motives are important when you tell a story. Chuck Colson, I knew as a man of faith, but you might remember he didn't first become well known in public because of his faith. He became well known because he was involved in Watergate. And later, his experience with that influenced the way he came to faith and understood the person and work of Jesus Christ. Because he said, at Watergate, there were 5 people who knew the truth. And if all 5 had just kept their mouth shut, no one could have proven anything. But they couldn't keep a secret. And so the secret got out and the consequences put them in jail. But he reflected on that and said, at the resurrection, there were 11 men who knew the truth. And if it were a lie, what are the odds that all 11 of them could keep that secret and live a lie, testify to something that they knew they had made up, unless, of course, the resurrection was real? 5 people in Watergate couldn't keep a secret. What are the odds that 11 who are threatened with their lives would keep a secret that was false? So, reflecting on his inability to maintain a lie, he's saying, surely these 11 couldn't have been lying. They must have actually witnessed Jesus after the resurrection, and it was part of what persuaded him. Paul, when he tells this story about what he has been through, does not sound like somebody who's making up a story about some phony philosopher prophet. He cannot believe that what he's telling about Jesus is made up. He's not telling these stories to get rich. He suffers for sharing the gospel. He's brutalized for sharing the gospel. He's imprisoned and flogged and beaten and pelted with stones and shipwrecked for telling the gospel. Surely he believes it's true. Nothing else would keep him going. And so, in the face of all that, he maintains the gospel of Jesus Christ with integrity, not from deceit, not from impure motives, not from trickery. He says, we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel. Even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God who tests the heart. His only point in preaching and teaching is to honor God. And so he's going to honor God no matter how people treat him, because he's not there for them. He's there for the honor of God. I would argue that you have also been entrusted with the message of salvation, and you have also been called to preach. I don't know how often you think of it, but I'm persuaded that in Matthew 28, the Great Commission is a commission that God has given to each one of us. That's where we read the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. When you teach, what is your motive? Are you teaching because you're embarrassed not to? Because you're afraid not to? Because people around you will tease you if you don't share the gospel? Or has it actually settled in your heart with such conviction that you cannot help but care for and about the people who are lost? And you cannot help but care for and about souls that may be going to hell but might have gone to heaven? Are you caring about the people that you see so much that you don't really care about your place and your position and your reputation? You just want to see souls saved. Paul said, as you know, and God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. They might have made demands as apostles of Christ. Apostles are due a certain degree of honor and respect, and he might have leaned on that, but what he's saying here is that he never did. He was just concerned with the people he came his way, not the privileges that went with his position. I'm at least a little bit familiar with that. I found as a chaplain, especially when I got to be a commander in 2005, that I was still operating mostly as a chaplain, and I didn't lean on my rank very much. Well, occasionally. Kathy will tell you that when I'd make a phone call on Navy business, I'd say, this is Chaplain Newbert, and I would ask my question. If I got wrong answers, I would become Commander Newbert, and I'd expect a better answer from them. But she would laugh every time she heard me say commander, and she'd wander out and look at me and shake her head and say, wrong answer? I'd say, oh, way wrong. I had to fix that. But the commander didn't come out much because I was trying to connect with people about their cares, their worries, their faith, their soul. And my rank didn't have anything to do with that. Every once in a while, I was perhaps too careless. I do remember on one exercise, I just happened to be there early, and the advance party is setting up the big canvas tents that would be our berthing areas. And, you know, we're at that point where somebody had to jump underneath the canvas and lift that first tent pole, so under I went. And I heard the staff sergeant say, there's an 05 under there. You guys get this up. Well, he was aware of my rank, and I had forgotten. Every once in a while, somebody had to remind me that maybe there were some things an 05 should not do. some of the younger troops do that. But that was never my first thought. My first thought was usually just, well, there's a job to be done. Why don't I do that? Paul, I think, operated that way. His first thought was the soul of the person he's talking to, not the fact that he's an apostle. And as the apostle, he might have been celebrated a little bit, that he might have had people fuss over him, that he could have demanded that people care for him better. No, all of that was secondary. If it happened, it's lovely, but what's important is that people hear about the gospel. And so Paul would do that. He said, "We were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children." When you share the gospel, how are you perceived? Are you perceived as somebody who is gentle, who's speaking from the heart because you care about the person to whom you're speaking? Or does somebody perceive you as a person who feels like, all right, it's a job I have to do. I guess I'll share this with you so I can move on and get along with the important parts of my day? How are you perceived? Are you a person who really cares? Paul said, "So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us." Do you hear how all of his witness comes from his heart and his soul? He has discovered the wonder of the love of God. And when he looks around him at people who don't know God, it breaks his heart, as it must break the heart of God to see how far people have wandered from the truth. And so when he shares, he's not sharing a teaching, a philosophy, an ethic. He's sharing his very self. This is his life. This is his whole soul, his own purpose. When he shares with you, he's sharing that way from the heart, deeply, because he loves you. Might be a person he's never met before, but he sees in them the image of the everlasting God, and he cares about the print of God on the soul of that other person. He wants them to come to faith. How do you share? When you share the facts of the gospel, is it sterile and artificial at arm's length, or are you sharing from the heart? When you share the truth of the gospel, is it something you've heard and learned to say? Or are you sharing what you yourself have become persuaded is true? Are you sharing the truths that moved your own heart and mind years ago? Ours is a living faith. It's an embodied faith. It's not a philosophy. There's nothing in the third person really about Christianity. It's all in person and personal. It's all involved in how we think and feel and act. We have to be a people who believe from the heart, who share from the heart, and who find that we're able to satisfy the God who tests our hearts, to see if we really love, if we really care, if we're really willing to live for someone else. God's promised that he takes care of us. We have no worries personally. Our concern should always be an outward concern for the people around us who might have missed the fact that the one true and living God loves them. And no matter what happens to you as you share the gospel, that sharing is what's critically important, so people can hear and believe and enter into eternity. Share from the heart. Share your very self. Don't ever let your witness be artificial. Don't ever let your witness spring from any motive other than the fact that you want to see that person in eternity. Find your calling and live it. Thanks be to God. Amen.